Okay. I'm going to be talking about Gene Autry this morning, and I have to preface this by saying I'm not really an expert on old-time country music, and I'm certainly not an expert on American foreign policy, so I'm kind of venturing into dangerous territory, but I hope you will treat it as a work in progress and bring in some sort of critical insight as we go. So usually if I give a talk and pontificate like many of the excellent speakers at the sessions in this conference, I only get covered about a third of the material that I want to talk about. So I'm going to do the old-fashioned thing of reading off the script. Okay. In his celebrity image, the glamorous country star Gene Autry played the role of public cowboy number one, a figure who combined masculine authority with a sense of fairness and justice. From the late 1930s onwards, he publicised his Cowboy Code, an ethical creed that in some iterations included respecting women and not advocating or possessing racially or religiously intolerant ideas. Autry's sense of social justice struck a popular chord during his lifetime. My aim in this research is to begin charting the political resonance of Autry's creed. I found it quite hard to unearth much about Autry's fans, many of whom were children in his heyday, but I have analysed the ways that the code was publicly discussed. So I guess the basis of my research has been looking at the way that different newspapers mentioned the code and talked about it. My theoretical inspiration, in part, comes from Rebels, Leroy Medavoy's 2005 study of Cold War celebrity. For Medavoy, rather than pit the individual against society, identity, as a psycho-political construct, works to harmonise them as necessary and reciprocal images of one another in the struggle for sovereign selfhood. In other words, Cold War celebrity images have arguably embodied new ideals of nationhood and taught young post-colonial nations the right ways to conduct themselves, ways that have favoured US hegemony. We should perhaps be a bit cautious about viewing music artists primarily as role models or as tools of Western imperialism. In Autry's case, however, public diplomacy was at the front and centre of his image. So, go there. Justice and fairness were central to his attraction for fans. Autry's guitar put enemies in their place without resorting to violence unless it was necessary. He was a public participant in US diplomacy, most obviously in his army career. Autry scholar Jonathan George-Smith, who became a fan as a young boy, recalled his hero's appeal by saying he could walk into a room and be the peacemaker, calm everybody just by his presence, and I think that came across on stage too. So how did Autry's peacemaker image function? I'll primarily examine the period from 1931 to 1957 because it was during this period that Autry released roughly 40 singles of new material and developed his career from recording artist to radio show presenter, Hollywood actor, war hero and TV star. And for almost the first decade, however, the Cowboy Code was not explicitly articulated as part of Autry's publicity. In fact, he had 3 singles in the first 4 years of the period I'm looking at that were not hits. 2 of these, The Last Roundup and Cowboy Heaven, could be described as range nostalgia, old-time country records, basically songs in which the ever-familiar dutiful ranch hand muses about his favourite cattle. Autry's Hollywood career took off in the mid-1930s after the Hays Code clamped down on sex and violence. Herbert Yates, a tycoon who made his fortune from the American Tobacco Company, owned the American Record Corporation and Republic Pictures. He figured that a cowboy who loved to sing rather than fight could provide a hit formula at the box office. Autry was already contracted to ARC and switched into Hollywood via Republic. His film debut occurred in 1934, and his first hit came a year later with That Silver-Haired Daddy of Mine, a country ditty which was used in the movie Tumbling Tumbleweeds, and it was about a sentimental son's view of his father. In 1939, Autry took his live show to Dublin, prompting a crowd of over 200,000 to demonstrate appreciation. Now, Autry's code set a trend. Similar codes were espoused by Roy Rogers, Hopalong Cassidy, the Lone Ranger, the Texas Ranger, and Wild Bill Hickok. What's interesting about such codes is that they seem to place the cowboy in a paternal role, building an idealised masculinity on the basis of social leadership through the provision of a walking ethical example. So let's have a look. This is a version of the Cowboy Code. Now the version I'm going to read out on my script here is slightly different, and the reason is that the Cowboy Code was iterated a number of times and they're all kind of slightly different. So my version reads, a cowboy never takes unfair advantage of an enemy, a cowboy never betrays trust, a cowboy always tells the truth, a cowboy is kind to small children, old folks and animals, a cowboy is free from racial and religious prejudices, a cowboy is helpful and if you're in trouble he lends a hand, a cowboy is a good worker, a cowboy is clean about his person, thought and deeds, so sort of morally clean, and a cowboy respects womanhood, his parents and the laws of the country, and finally, a cowboy is a patriot. Now, I'm not even... the weird thing is that if I was to do a written piece about this, I couldn't actually publish the code because in the mid-90s it was copyrighted by the AUTRY'S estate. So the story of the code is, in a sense, the story of American life. So, in theory, perhaps we could trace the assumptions used in the Cowboy Code back to the French Declaration on the Rights of Man or the American Bill of Rights. Two less pristine sources may have immediately informed Autry, however, the unwritten Cowboys Code of the West and Robert Baden-Powell's 1908 book, Scouting for Boys, which produced an itemised list of Scouts law. A key difference between Autry's code and these predecessors was that they placed emphasis on the model citizen being cheery and thrifty. Baden-Powell's kind of austere edict that each boy should save every penny he could so as not to be a burden on society arguably seemed irrelevant after the Dust Bowl era. From 1932 onwards, President Roosevelt's New Deal placed responsibility for relieving poverty on government schemes primarily, not individual savers. Roosevelt had wider concerns too. According to historian Robert Schulzinger, in his inaugural address, Roosevelt announced that in our relations with the Western Hemisphere we shall be guided by the principle of the good neighbour. In actuality, New Dealers followed the outlines of the policies set down by Herbert Hoover. The United States maintained control where it could over the Western Hemisphere but avoided the use of force. It would use persuasion and economic pressure to get the Latin American governments themselves to follow American leadership. Two Autry songs seem particularly to resonate with this idea. Mexicali Rose from 1935 and South of the Border from 1939. In both of these, the cowboy takes a female love interest from a different race and country, arguably offering a paternal model of international relations. In 1940, the inventor of Time magazine, Henry Luce, argued that the world had entered the American century, a project that called for strategic, economic and global dominance. The Council on Foreign Relations created a research network of over 300 academics, diplomats, military leaders and journalists called the War and Peace Studies Project to bring the goal about. Under the rather clipped headline of Suggests Cowboy Code in Governing Nation, the first Cowboy Code appeared that year in the Illinois newspaper called The Dispatch. It read, "Dictators and other heads of nations should follow the rules laid down for Western movie heroes. If they did, declared Gene Autry today, the world would be a happier place." The August 24th story also offered an apologetic, that was a quote from them, an apologetic quote from Autry that said, "Maybe I shouldn't spout off about such a big project, but the thing is, see if you don't agree with me." Every point of the then unnumbered 8-point code, so that the codes we saw was a 10-point code, at this point the code was 8 points, began with he. So he will not, he will, he will not. In this way, the imputed adult male cowboy was assigned a role to husband and protect not only a physical territory, the ranch or the range, and its animal assets, but also a social one. He had enemies, but he was duty-bound, the creed suggested, to play fair and care for the welfare of others, as well as enlisting public citizens by asking them to make an ethical choice about what was right. AUTRY'S framing of the subject playfully questioned the wrong-headed ethical choices of dictators and other heads of nations and placed himself in a position of moral leadership. Alongside of arms sales and aid to the European allies, in 1941 Roosevelt argued that America stood for 4 freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. The freedoms justified a foreign policy which allowed the country to lease or lend up to $7 billion in arms supplies and other supplies to shore up US interests in foreign territories. In 1942, AUTRY became a tech sergeant in the US Army and eventually went on to achieve status as a war pilot. A press story that year explained that AUTRY'S grandfather, a Baptist minister, appreciating the wholesome influence of the traditional cowboy code of honour, encouraged him in his youthful ambition to become a Hollywood cowboy like his hero Harry Carey. Another story appeared that year when AUTRY'S income hit $600,000 and his business empire was estimated at $7 million. It explained that in his films, AUTRY battles single-handedly against everybody else, but the business model behind the brand was more sociable and included a movie company, a radio company, a rodeo, 2 music publishers and a flying school. The police used the code to question whether the celebrity, then aged 40, lived up to his image as an off-screen, as an entrepreneur. So let's have a look. I think we've got, yeah. In his public life as a screen cowboy, AUTRY can exhibit none of the qualities that have made him a successful businessman. It is not easy to live a life being circumscribed by a strict cowboy code, the violation of which is likely to draw protesting screams from the 80,000 fans who write to him every month. The writer elaborated, AUTRY the cowboy cannot take unfair advantage of anyone, even an enemy. He must not smoke or drink in public, and he cannot kiss the girl in any of his pictures. What's interesting here is not just the extension of the code to general, restrained or civilised conduct, but the idea that AUTRY had set down an ethical marker that created a kind of participatory game with his dedicated audience. The thousands of fans who now, it seemed, loved him primarily because of his personal adherence to the code which his character professed. In other words, the piece supposed that AUTRY mattered to his fan base precisely because his screen character embodied the code. It became an ideal that he was duty-bound to live. World War II continued the upward trajectory of US economic growth established by the New Deal. In the summer of 1944, the major economic powers convened to create the International Monetary Fund to lend money to nations that found themselves short of foreign reserves. Half of the IMF's $10 billion capital fund came from the USA. The fund could demand changes in the borrower's economic and trade policies, so in effect it operated as a policy instrument in favour of Western interests. The US dominance was underscored in 1945 when it became the first country to drop an atomic bomb in combat, ushering in the Cold War era, a time associated with issuing threats about domestic subversion at home as a way to generate support for foreign policy based on the idea of the Soviets. In 1947, the National Security Act was passed by Congress and it led to the creation of the CIA. America became a country where external threats were translated into internal distrust. In this environment, congruence and honesty were perceived as sterling qualities. Towards the end of the 1940s, explicit mention of the Cowboy Code was becoming more frequent and a regular aspect of AUTRY'S image. Indeed, AUTRY'S biographer, this is Holly George Warren, dates the code back to this time where she sees his 1948 Melody Ranch radio shows, a 1948 Life magazine article, contemporary fan magazines, and the 1949 press book for the film Riders in the Sky is displaying the code. Okay, so let me see. Oh yeah, so this is this is just my little graphic of kind of how US policy was changing during the period. And I put the kind of more like alliance-based or globalist kind of formations in green, and then these kind of noting kind of the end of colonialism and the formation of young countries, and the blue ones are just what America's doing different ways. Okay, the emergence of existentialism as a prominent humanist philosophy during the war was particularly useful to the US project, aiming to cultivate newly decolonised nations as through secular democracy and capitalist trade. Under the guise of democratic self-determination, it promoted autonomy from the totalitarian rule, whether based on religious traditions or communist ideals. Formulated on the terrain of subjectivity, such self-determination was expressed as authentically following one's inner truth. In his analysis of American life between 1945 and 1965, called The Permissive Society, Alan Patigny makes the point that God was reimagined as a benign entity in the American public sphere. The austere kind of Protestant doctrine of original sin could then be replaced by the idea of searching inside oneself for identity. For AUTRY'S music, the most obvious shift in the immediate post-war period was an emphasis on the Cowboys' male victim, somebody broken inside from romantic rejection. This comes through in singles from 1945 to 1947, including At the Mail Call Today and Don't Hang Around Me Anymore. An interesting contrast is provided by Silver Spurs on Golden Stairs, which is another AUTRY song from 1946 that emphasises social good works rather than repentant as the route to heaven. In 1950, AUTRY moved into television to produce and star in his own show. In 1953, having success in his television career, he retired from the movies. Perhaps the key achievement of US diplomacy from this era was the development of the United Nations. In 1949, the UN Declaration on Human Rights in part matched the concerns of the Cowboy Code, not just in its general interest in fairness within the remit tacitly encouraging democracy, but also explicitly in Article 18. While the UN Charter could be read as protecting its notional rights holder against religious authority, this particular article, influenced perhaps by existentialism, read that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. The notion of following an inner voice of conscience, which became part of Hollywood films like The Robe in the early 1950s, was not referenced by AUTRY'S Cowboy Code. Instead, the code emphasised a sense of duty. The idea of sticking to the rules was repeated in a press story in 1953 that called the Western fans the sternest film critics. It said, any deviation from protocol laid down by the fans is sure to call down on some unsuspecting cowboy star's head an indignant torrent of mail calculated to make him change his erring ways. Such erring, according to actor George Montgomery, included shooting the enemy in the back, not looking after his horse properly, and sagebrush smooching with women. This is the key term, I think, sagebrush smooching. In the wake of the Kinsey reports in 1948 and 1953, American popular culture arguably reformulated the UN notion of subjective freedom as liberation from sexual repression. For a rather acerbic column joking about the expensive prima donna nature of Hollywood horses, in 1952 the actor Robert Mitchum explained that after jousting with their animals, some hurt riders who had some kind of problem with their horses had refused point blank to recognise the Cowboy Code, which requires the hero at the picture's end to give his loyal, ever-loving steed a kiss. In 1955, an equally cynical piece in the Arizona Republic articulated AUTRY'S code, arguing, I think it should last as long as Custer's Last Stand at the box office. The theme was echoed in a 1956 story in the Louisville Courier-Journal. Featuring quotes from AUTRY, the piece related the Cowboy Code to the singer's own image, explaining that he could not be seen smoking, drinking, disrespecting a lady or older person, kissing a girl, or using slang. Autry's career, it explained, was built on children using him as a role model and copying his conduct, his bearing, the habits he shows himself to have in his appearances. Autry added, kids, like their heroes, to be smart rather than tough. We outwit the enemy if we can. I use my fists if there's a logical reason for it and it's necessary. Finally, he said, as a matter of fact, my life is governed mostly by children. The interesting thing about this is some of the research on Autry's career and fans suggests it's actually young women, kind of maybe like 18 to 22 or 23 that were some of his mainstay fans. So my life is governed mostly by children. In this formulation, Autry had emerged by serving child fans of the Western with family entertainment and was then controlled by the demands of his following. In other words, the Codes was effectively becoming positioned as a naive set of ideals enforced by the marketplace that no real person could follow. In April 1956, a youth TV show was launched called Ramar of the Jungle, where the hero kissed a girl because his young audience actually demanded it. In other words, the days where you can, and this is a quote from one of the stories, where you can kiss a horse but not the girl, were gone. The new cultural world belonged to adolescents rather than children, and the 50s consumer boom was underway. As Peter Carling said, Elvis Presley not only looked like a sexed-up riot, but sounded like one too. Autry switched back to children's songs, but his ghost was riding high because the generation that had grown up with him on record, radio, film, TV and comic books was now coming of age. According to Caroline Marlin, the movie that a young Elvis had watched at the night that Dewey Phillips first played his earliest record on radio was Goldtown Ghost Riders and Autry Fleck. In Jack Kerouac's 1957 novel On the Road, the narrator's sound describes G. Moriarty, the fascinating central character, as being like a young Gene Autry. In this changed geopolitical and cultural world, Autry was just an echo. As rebels replaced peacemakers, rock and rollers replaced singing cowboys, and codes were replaced by cool. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. Thanks. Questions? Tom?
Thank you, it was really interesting. Actually, what's the standing of Gene Autry fandom today? Does it exist? Does it exist at all? Is there a fandom, a group of people that still champion him?
That I don't actually know because I haven't looked at the present time, but I know that I think his fan club magazine lasted until about the 50s and 60s. And in fact, in the press stories about him, kind of from about the 60s onwards, the entrepreneurial side of his career took over from the singing cowboy side, so that he became somebody who was basically an entrepreneur who just happened to be exploiting the role of the singing cowboy to develop the capital through which he could use his... But one thing that led me on this trail in part was I found some YouTube footage of Hillary Clinton saying she was an Autry fan and she liked the Cowboy Code.
I've just come back from doing some research in Oklahoma and Tulsa, there's Kane's Ballroom. There's a big Western swing venue like sort of Grand Ole Opry of Tulsa, but in there is a huge picture of Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and some of these singing cowboys, and they're incredibly revered. Around Tulsa, there's quite a lot of murals and graffiti for Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, for Gene Autry. And my way into Gene Autry is through Woody Guthrie, because Woody Guthrie was an incredible fan of Gene Autry. And which I think is like really interesting and ironic, isn't it? Because like him having this machine kills fascists on his guitar, the opposite of.
Yeah, but there's something in what you say about existentialism, and Woody was a very broad and humanist thinker, and he may have picked a lot of that. And Woody Guthrie also did cowboy music, before he did folk music, really. But none of this, But anyway. Okay. So yes.
Question at the back.
Thank you, Mark. That was really interesting. I picked up on the part about Autry sort of being locked in by his own image. That he couldn't not be Gene Autry. He could not be his persona. And it reminded me of more modern celebrities and the way we look at them and police behavior, and also down to stuff like Untitled Chapter, the girl who played Buffett in the Vampire Slayer, was not able to eat in a McDonald's until she was over 18 because once as a child she said something in a commercial about always eating in Burger King and how these behaviors lock people in. I was wondering if you had thought about the trajectory of that kind of thing as we move from pre-war to post-war to capitalism, or to peak capitalism.
Yeah, well, from what I've seen in discussions of the code, by that, like in the period that I'm talking about, towards the end of it, it's like, oh, get real. You can't be just kissing your horse. You need to, like, you can't live up to this code. But actually, when you follow discussions of the code through to the 1980s and 1990s, it was like, no, Autry was good because he lived the code, and by the time you get to his obituary, it's because he lived the code in his business life as well as his screen life. So it completely moves. It kind of moves with the sort of historical period.
That's super interesting.
And he did set up that notion of the cowboy ethic.
Yeah, although some people actually believe that Herbert Yates invented the code and Autry just sort of took it. Yeah.
It's really interesting because teaching subjects like communications, I teach courses on persuasion and media, which involves a lot of semiotics. And one of the things that we often deal with is the Cowboy code, which is always a very abstract thing. I never really knew that there was actually a code. So it's really, the sort of things that I refer to more is like Marlboro cigarettes, and the image of the cowboy.
Yeah.
How much do you think this actual code affected all that mythologizing about what the cowboy lifestyle is?
I think it heavily affected it because even before Autry there was the idea of the code of the West, which was kind of like the unwritten cowboy code because Autry kind of codifies. And I think as ideas about cowboys got more complicated, then that was just seen as kind of being a white hat cowboy. But one of the things I kind of often ponder is the extent to which celebrities after Autry have adopted the cowboy code, whether they're cowboys or not. So, I was watching Mission Impossible the other day, and I kind of thought, there might be a sense in which Tom Cruise takes on a certain amount of the cowboy code in his public image, or Bruce Springsteen or somebody.
Could I just pick up? Sorry.
Sure.
Thank you. You made the link between the New Deal. We use force only when we need and aggressive, and generously, which means those Hollywood movies. Can you speak about this link? What do you mean by that exactly? That Hollywood is kind of used as a tool for the government, that Hollywood understood that it was two parallel movements. We need an explanation about that.
Yes, I agree. There's some marshy territory in what I'm talking about, and that is part of it. Now, I'm not an expert on that, but I would point you to this book, where the guy really goes into a lot of detail about the Hollywood films and the relationship with the government. And at one point, I think the quote he uses is that Autry delivered the presidential dope as Western entertainment. So he thinks there is a very strong kind of, almost that there was a partnership going on between Autry and the government. Now, I don't know, at what point does an association and a sort of positive association become like being used as a tool? There definitely seems to be some strong connections in his case. I'm not sure about whether that generalises to the rest of Hollywood. I think it's a bit like this argument in Rebels, which is, you know, part of me thinks it's a bit too deterministic.
Yeah, but no, the question with that is always, like in most of cultural studies, how
does it work?
Yes, yes. So, because if we have two parallel movements, it was not before the same. So how does it start? What makes the things happen?
Well, I know that, like, for example, when Autry was inducted into the army, that took place live on air on his radio show. So, you know, there was sort of, you know, the relationship was incredibly close at certain points.
The role of Republic pictures is.
I
don't really, but
okay.
I think there is the role of Republic Pictures is hugely significant. The relationships that they had outside Hollywood. One that he's looking at can be looked at. Some very interesting stuff there in terms of their influence on that creation of the American cowboy hero.
What also amazes me is that this is not to answer your question, which is, that Elvis made 3 pictures a year and people thought he was overworking in the 60s. Autry made 8 pictures a year. So,
if we just take one more and then...
Yeah, I was just going to riff on what this gentleman said. So I got the synapses going on, so it's not really a question, it's more just a bit of an investigation. That the actual statement of the Cowboy Code could be seen as a manifestation of kind of Freud's notion of imago. And actually, you know, the start of celebrity, because there's a big discussion around the notion of celebrity studies, that it comes out of this traditional thing of the imago. And most people, everyone, if you believe Freud, everyone's got that imago, but very few people would actually sit and write it out and then be sutured into it and rigidly, you know, most pop stars don't do that. Most pop stars are shapeshifters and continually change their imago depending on, you know, on how they feel. So it was just a comment. I know it's nothing to do with your research or anything. I just thought I'd be a gobshite and share it, you know.
That's an interesting thought. So you're saying that this is kind of Freudianism made into conscious ethics?
Yeah. You know, I mean, I like that idea of imago, and if you know, some of the stuff I'm interested in is that notion of how do people manage to get up on stage, and especially if you've worked with artists and realise how shy and retiring and unsure of themselves they are. Then they go on stage and they do this amazing, then they come back off and go into this thing of self-doubt and panic. You know, and to me that's a classic magnification, you know, of imago theory, which is why you put costume on. It's why you know, put.
So can you give us a simplified sort of 2-sentence explanation of what imago theory is, so that we were all up to speed?
Well, I didn't have anything to say on this. I just it wasn't until this chap said and my brain started going, because that's how I work, and I go, oh my God, I just do that type of thing. But the actual writing down of it is something that very few people would do. I'm sure that Madonna or David Bowie never sat down and kind of go, do you know what? This is the code of David Bowie. You will always shock. You will always, you know, it would be a fun class to do. I'm actually thinking, because we're all educators with students. You know, what would your code be? What would your 8-point, 10-point code be?
Dress code.
That's a very good idea.
Yeah, I was just thinking because we moved towards project-based learning, you know, as a pedagogy, we don't stand up and lecture anymore, but to do a thing of go, here's your AUTRY'S code, let's invest it, get it. We've now got 2 hours left in the class, go away into groups and come back with your own.
I did find somebody who did that, actually.
I'm going to do it.
There's somebody who did like the Cowboy Code in business and ethics.
Yeah.
And then there has been somebody teaching with that, doing that I saw.
Damn, I just originated that.
They also had an extra rule, which was what would your 11th rule be? So students to sort of think of what their own one was. Yeah.
I mean, you could play around with that. I mean, it's a little tiny book that could come up. Is, you know, what's the punk rock code? Always be offensive, always be rude. Make sure you always start the fight. What would the code be for a folk singer? You know, never use electric. Sorry, I
Go on, Tom. Move on. Well, the website's really interesting. So I teach pop music students, and one of the first things we do is what makes a good musician.
Yeah.
And so they'll do exactly what you said. They'll sing groups on time, organised, all this one.
yeah.
And the idea of that is to go, well, great, this is what I'm looking for from you, and this is what I want you to expect from me. So it's a really good way of just getting the whole group lined up.
The University of Huddersfield, inspiring tomorrow's professionals.